Are our classic idealized heroes pillars of inspiration that make us better people? Or are they naive relics of simpler times whose principles would never hold up in the complexity of the real world? Is the gritty realism and moral ambiguity of modern storytelling more valuable for its nuance and deconstruction of traditional values? Or is it merely cynical and pointless, leaving its audience no better for it? These are questions that have stuck in my mind for years, ever since Zack Snyder's darker take on my favorite characters stirred up controversy, right as I was becoming old enough to appreciate their moral complexity and ask serious questions about what really makes a hero. If you didn't notice the length of this video compared to my usual content, I have a lot to say about this discussion because it's one with far more nuance than a lot of people realize. So today, let me step back and take a broader look at the impact of this debate on our culture and what it means for us today, and then analyze a number of examples from our popular culture to see what merit we can find in both sides of the spectrum. But before I get into it, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. I really appreciate your watch time, so I hope you stick with me to the end, but I have the video broken in chapters so you can skim through the main points. If you've got a short attention span, at least watch the conclusion. Now, without further ado, let's dive into what makes our stories worth telling in the first place, because that's really what this discussion is about. Why do we tell stories? What should the stories we tell do for us, individually or as a culture? Are stories meant to inspire and make sense of the world with idealized, simplified versions of reality, with pillars of virtue to emulate and all the world's evils embodied for them to defeat? Or should stories reflect the world as it is, with all its messiness and moral complexity, where right and wrong aren't always easy to determine, heroes are hard to find, and the good guys don't always save the day? Can we learn more from these stories with their complexity than we could from our idealized heroes? Or does such ambiguity only breed a cynical nihilism? This is a complicated and often quite heated discussion that has been going on for decades and has only gotten more intense as subversion of traditional morality has become the norm in recent years. Nowadays, it seems more common to see an evil douchebag knockoff of Superman than to see an actual heroic treatment of the world's first and greatest superhero. Fantasy stories are more interested in imitating Game of Thrones' dark and bloody webs of deceit and betrayal than emulating Lord of the Rings' epic tale of humility, bravery, and love. Disney, once the bastion of heroism and inspiration in children's tales, has embraced the age dominated by edgy anti-heroes of dubious morality. Even when characters are presented as straight-laced heroes we can root for, their motives and morals are rarely noble and selfless, in a time when narcissistic individualism is seen as a virtue. Many lament this trend, and if you didn't notice from my tone, I largely agree with them. The thing is, this isn't by any means a new or unique phenomenon. If we take a look at fiction throughout history, we'll see plenty of cycles play out across cultures, with idealistic heroism and brutal realism taking their turns in the spotlight. In fact, most ancient mythologies were dominated by what we'd call realism. I dare you to find more than a couple examples of noble chivalry and selfless heroism in Greek or Norse myths. Though, if you know of any cultures with mythologies more prominently featuring traditional heroism, tell me in the comments, I'd love to know. In ancient Greece, the tragedy was the predominant genre in theater. Stories were not expected to have happy endings, and their protagonists usually fell victim to their own destructive vices in the end. What we think is modern and subversive now actually goes back to some of our oldest recorded works of fiction. It wasn't until the medieval times, in the religious world of Catholic Europe, when stories of chivalrous heroes standing for Christian principles of virtue while defeating the forces of evil really became popular, with the romantic tales like those of King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot replacing the brutal myths of the pagans. But with the Renaissance came an artistic return to the classical period, including with storytelling, as Shakespeare brought dark tragedies and stories exploring the complexity and nuance of morality back into the mainstream. We may think of his work today as being traditional simply because it's old, but in his day, his writing was every bit as radical and subversive as Frank Herbert or George R. R. Martin were in the 20th century. And since his time, plenty of other artists have been influential in shifting the cultural zeitgeist from one extreme to the other. Heck, Walt Disney was subverting the dark and brutal fairy tales he adapted into light-hearted and inspiring children's tales even more than modern Disney is trying to subvert them back now. If you'd like a video going into more depth on the patterns of idealism and cynicism we've seen repeated in literature throughout history, I'd recommend this video by Pilgrims, which will be linked in the description. And so the pendulum has swung from the dawn of civilization, and so it will until the end of time. This battle we think is so critical in our day is not new, and it will never be won once and for all, as long as people are still telling stories in a corrupt and fallen world. With all that said, the point of this video is not to say this conflict doesn't matter. It is important, but I want to put it in proper context, and I want to try to offer a more nuanced perspective on the subject and acknowledge the merit of both sides. To be totally clear, I am very aware that I am simplifying this conflict in our literature and pop culture into two clear sides, and I know there are many more specific ideological themes at war with one another in our works of fiction. I'm not here to talk about any such ideologies or philosophies specifically, because those will constantly change with time and vary across cultures. I'm simply going to be talking about the broader, more universal ideas of objective morality versus moral ambiguity. If you haven't guessed yet, I believe in objective morality and the importance of it in fiction, but I do value the merit of moral ambiguity in storytelling. I believe stories should teach us about life, encourage us to ponder our humanity, and ultimately inspire us to be better people. And I think both sides of the spectrum play crucial roles in helping us do so. However, as with most spectrums, there is also a danger in the extremes. So let's look at both sides and examine each of their merits and dangers, starting by exploring what many would call realism. A little while ago, I watched a video by the Star Wars channel Thor Skywalker, again, link in the description, comparing Andor to the Acolyte and exploring why both introduced a level of moral ambiguity into Star Wars, while only one was well received by the fandom. Surely the biggest reason Andor succeeded while the Acolyte failed was that the former was just a far better written show than the latter. However, putting overall quality aside, fans generally found Andor's moral complexity to be a brilliant way of adding depth and nuance to the Star Wars saga's existing themes, whereas the Acolyte was seen as a spiteful subversion of everything the Jedi and the Sith stood for and everything George Lucas tried to say with his stories. But going even deeper than that, by putting aside the one's love for the original material and the other's apparent hatred for it, let's just look at each series' approach to their morality, independent of the franchise as a whole. Thor Skywalker's video talked about how Andor used moral ambiguity, while the Acolyte used gray morality. What's the difference, you may ask? Well, this definition may be somewhat arbitrary, but for the sake of this discussion, ambiguity is about adding complexity and nuance to a conflict, to challenge the viewer to think harder and more critically about the philosophies and ideologies being presented. On the other hand, gray morality just blurs all ethical lines entirely to eliminate any critical thinking about the morality of the character's actions and justify anything anyone does. The writers can have characters do whatever they want, and the audience is expected not to think about who's really right or wrong, or judge anyone for their actions because, well, there is no right or wrong. While ambiguity is meant to encourage deeper critical thought, gray morality tends to be a lazy way to avoid such intelligent analysis, using a nihilistic and individualistic worldview to justify anything and everything the characters do. Let's get back to Star Wars to see what this looks like in action. The Acolyte tries to flip the good guys, bad guys narrative completely by saying the Jedi are corrupt douchebags and the Sith are victims we should root for. It doesn't justify or soften the Sith's heinous acts to do this. It just wants you to think that their horrible acts of murder aren't that bad, because the Jedi are meanies who deserved it. This isn't just me, by the way. The showrunner has admitted to projecting herself onto the Sith and making them the underdogs, with the Jedi representing her oppressive parents and the religious institutions she resents, I guess. Like I said, I don't want to get into specific ideologies in this video, so check out Greg Owen's videos about Leslie Headland if you want to know more about her twisted philosophy. Again, link in the description. But essentially, the show tries to blur all definitions of good and evil and make you root for horrible people doing horrible things because, guess what? Everyone's a horrible person who does horrible things. There's no good guys or bad guys, just a bunch of bad guys, but you're expected to root for the ones who were once seen as the real bad guys just because they're the underdogs now. The story actively despises objective or traditional morality and is just the writer's way of injecting themselves and their spiteful nihilistic worldview into the Star Wars universe. Meanwhile, Andor doesn't try to idolize the villains or deliberately rebel against the entire moral framework of the franchise. It merely humanizes its characters, showing bad guys with understandable motives and heroes who do questionable things. It asks very tough questions about war, about utilitarianism and the price of freedom, all completely within the moral framework of the franchise. The Empire is unquestionably an oppressive regime, but that doesn't mean everyone in it is a soulless monster, and that doesn't mean everyone fighting it is a perfect hero. It shows the harsh, brutal realities of war and uses its realism to add further nuance, complexity, and depth to a well-established conflict, challenging the audience to ask tough questions without just trying to subvert the story's themes or do away with all traditional morality. That's what I believe realism and ambiguity can do when used thoughtfully by a writer with an intention beyond the simple subversion of morality or promotion of their own twisted worldview. But Andor still works with certain moral assumptions, such as that the Empire is evil and must be destroyed, and that the greater good is worth fighting for, even if it asks at what cost. So what happens if we go further and challenge even those assumptions? What if we honestly ask, what is even worth fighting for? Well, that's what stories like The Last of Us do. In the game and the show, though I'm only familiar with the latter, two moral truths are presented and reiterated in every conflict. The first is that it is the people we love, the people we fight for, who give our lives purpose and meaning. That love is the greatest thing worth fighting for, and the people we love are worth fighting for at any cost. The other philosophy in the show is that the greater good requires the sacrifice of individuals, that the good of all can only be achieved at great cost, and the ends justify the means. But in its final episode, the show puts these two ideals in direct opposition and forces Joel to choose between the greater good and the one person who still gives his life meaning. I won't spoil the ending beyond that, because you really should watch it if you haven't, but the story doesn't provide an easy answer or claim that there is an objectively right answer. The story is heartbreaking and hard to watch at many points, but also incredibly inspiring at times. Most importantly, it feels incredibly real. This is realism at its best, forcing you to think about issues with no clear answers, presenting different, contradictory ideas of morality, and exploring them without taking a definitive side. While I do believe there is an objective good worth fighting for, which our stories should teach and explore in some way, or else I feel all stories would be essentially meaningless, I do think we need stories like this that force us to ask the tough questions, confront painful truths, and really define our morality. So after some thought, I have come to believe the primary merit of morally ambiguous stories is how thought-provoking they are. That was once going to be the main point of this video, and I might have once ended it there, but then I uploaded what is now my most popular video on the channel, How the Penguin Broke Hollywood's Antihero Problem, and some of the comments really got me thinking. The Penguin is a morally ambiguous show with no real heroes and a truly villainous lead that we are meant to hate by the final episode, so I was shocked to see the sheer number of people legitimately defending Oswald Cobb, a narcissistic psychopath, as a genuine hero. Several different comments, some with a lot of likes, claim that Oz's humble circumstances made his ruthless ambition not only understandable, but admirable. Some even went so far as to argue that everyone Oz killed had it coming, making his heartless sadism somehow justified, which, if you've seen the entire show, you should know is a ridiculous argument. Reading and responding to these comments reminded me that even when these stories of villainous characters with complex and questionable morality are told well, we still need heroes. No matter how thought-provoking our stories are, we still need stories that inspire us. The Penguin is an incredible show that I found very thought-provoking. It does not have totally gray morality like The Acolyte, even though it doesn't have any heroes. The Penguin is clearly a villain by the end of his 8-episode character study, and even though Sophia is much easier to root for, the show also has moments where she recognizes the harm her actions have inflicted on innocent people, to remind us that she's no hero either. So I feel this show still uses intelligent moral complexity and recognizes evil as evil. I see it as a warning about people like Oz and the whole lifestyle of crime and corruption the show depicts. But even if our culture is full of intelligent, complex stories that explore morality without altogether disregarding it, if we don't have enough stories with clear, genuine heroes to uplift and inspire us, we can still lose sight of the moral standards against which we should judge our characters and their stories. How can we recognize evil without any standard of good to use as a point of reference? Villains shouldn't exist in a vacuum. They serve as foils to our heroes, to challenge them, which is why, as much as I love the time we spent with Oz in his show, I'm glad he exists within the world of Batman, so our masked hero can remind us that there is still good in Gotham worth fighting for, even as the city's villains wallow in its evil. Unfortunately, looking at our popular culture as a whole, I see far more depictions of evil than good. I believe the writers whose work contributes to our culture and society have a responsibility to better it with their stories. But when all I see is a gray sea of ambiguity with no one to emulate or root for, I don't see a society striving for anything better. I see a society resigned to the cynicism and vice its media is obsessed with. I believe there needs to be a balance. Classic dystopian stories like 1984 have no real heroes, show us little goodness in humanity, and leave us frightened of our worst possible future. Does that make them bad? No, they are warnings, and needed ones. But without stories that give us hope for our future and show us the good we're capable of, I don't know that such warnings are enough to help us avoid the grim futures they depict. Shows like Breaking Bad or The Penguin show us the worst people are capable of, how good men can become monsters, and how cycles of violence and corruption are perpetuated. These are not stories about heroes, and while they can teach us valuable things, I believe they need to exist in balance with positive and inspirational stories of heroism and virtue to show us what we should aspire to be and how to break those cycles. We need both. Grim warnings and cautionary tales can lead to despair and nihilistic cynicism without messages of hope, while on the other hand, it may be just as true that simple, idealized stories of heroism can lead to blind, uneducated naivety without allowing audiences to face the world's darkest realities. And that is one issue with a lot of traditional heroic stories that I feel tends to undermine their abilities to inspire as they should, which I need to address. Frankly, what may be almost as bad as a lack of heroes is heroes who don't teach us anything. Just as moral ambiguity can become totally gray and lose all meaning, so too can stories of black and white, good and evil, become meaningless when there is so little nuance and complexity that it's unable to speak to our humanity. I feel these stories are generally harmless, and can be inspiring in some ways, but when they fail to address the real issues of our human failings, and don't say anything meaningful we can apply to our lives, they can't really inspire us as much as they should, can they? Now, this issue can crop up in well-intentioned and otherwise inspiring stories when writers are scared to really challenge their hero. I always hate when superheroes come off as self-righteous or disingenuous, or just simply boring, because the writers have to cheat to keep their moral integrity intact. And then they're supposed to look better than more believable characters who never got the same loopholes, without having earned it. The worst examples of this for me are false dilemmas, where the writers pretend to put the hero in a difficult moral situation only to have them BS their way out of it simply by being the hero. One of the most blatant examples I can think of is in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man, in which Green Goblin forces Peter to choose between saving MJ or saving a trolley full of kids. Of course he manages to save both because he's Spider-Man, proving absolutely nothing. Then there's times when the hero has some liberty another character doesn't, often thanks to their powers, and then lectures them on a moral principle that they've never had to break thanks to their super privilege. As much as I love Superman and Lois, I have found examples of this in the show, namely when John Henry kills a guy in self-defense, and when he very validly argues that he didn't have a choice, Superman condescendingly tells him, "There's always a choice." Which can be a great line in some contexts, but here, it feels hollow because, well, what choice is Superman referring to? Letting the guy kill him and leave his daughter fatherless? John Henry isn't invincible, and he doesn't have freeze breath to harmlessly immobilize his enemies. He was about to die and used the only weapon he had to stop his attacker. I find this example especially funny because John uses his hammer on people with and without powers all the time, and for some reason, this is the only time it's as lethal as you'd expect such a brutal weapon to be. But that's besides the point. Which leads to the third kind of disingenuous moral integrity, which is straight up moral luck, where bad things only happen as a result of people's actions when the audience is supposed to see them as the bad guy, while the good guys do the same things and everyone miraculously survives. I find this especially common in Batman movies where the Dark Knight is blowing up and smashing cars willy-nilly in every car chase, and they make a point of letting us know everyone's fine afterwards so that we don't have to question him when, by all rights, his kill count should be as high as his enemies. Look, while I get why people don't want to see their heroes subverted, and things like the whole evil douchebag Superman trope are getting very old, I don't think it's subversion at all to challenge our hero's morality in ways that most writers are too scared to do for fear of making the hero seem less heroic. In fact, I find heroes far more inspiring when they face realistic moral dilemmas and don't get to cheat their way out of them. I love getting to see heroes face difficult challenges just like the rest of us, and do their best to do the right thing in a messy and imperfect world, where the right thing isn't always obvious and is rarely easy. In fact, I think the more a moral truth, or a character representing that truth, is tested, the stronger and more inspiring it is. Of course, if I'm talking about moral ambiguity and subversion in superhero films, I've got to talk about Zack Snyder's Superman, and if it hasn't already, this is where the video may get controversial. Look, his movies have issues, especially Batman v Superman, but I always get riled up whenever people say he tried to deconstruct the character and strip him of everything that makes him Superman. Not that I'm defending Zack Snyder himself, to be clear. I love his movies, or at least aspects of them, to varying degrees, but I can't claim he understands his superheroes. I mean, he's made it pretty clear in a number of interviews that he's little more than an immature, testosterone-fueled edgelord with little to no appreciation for superheroes' role as moral icons. But he didn't write his DC movies. He just put his style on them. I'm sure he played a big role in the direction of the story of BVS and his version of Justice League, but Man of Steel was honestly more Christopher Nolan's story than Zack Snyder's, and David Goyer was the main writer of both Man of Steel and BVS. So he's the one I'm going to be giving the credit to from now on. Now, Man of Steel has its issues, though I believe it's far more good than bad. And BVS has its gold, though I wouldn't blame anyone for finding it more bad than good. However, I couldn't disagree more with those who claim that Henry Cavill's Superman is a cynical and morally gray anti-hero compared to his more traditional incarnations. Regardless of how well his second outing actually developed his character and his plot, the intention of both of David Goyer's stories was not to cynically deconstruct the hero, but to challenge him in ways few writers have the guts to do, by putting him in the real world, where there isn't always some contrived story mechanic to get you out of every moral dilemma. Zod was determined to fight Superman and kill as many people as he could in the process until he died, and there was no kryptonite at the time or some other magic technology to contain him. So after avoiding the inevitable as long as he could, at the expense of countless lives, Clark finally accepted that he was the only one who could end this, and every second he hesitated, more would die, and he finally did what he had to do, even as it tore him apart. And as he later goes about trying to be the hero we love, he finds himself in a world that loves to hate, as he's relentlessly judged and attacked for his every action, finding that no matter how good your intentions, sometimes there is no choice without consequences that affect someone. Yet he takes responsibility for his actions, and though he wonders if the world just wants him gone, he ultimately gives his life for it. I know there's a lot that BVS failed to do right, and its themes weren't explored as well as they could have been, but the themes themselves are worth exploring. What would it really be like to be Superman in a world where someone is always going to be judging your every action? How can you always be the hero when, no matter what you do, someone is going to be hurt, someone is going to lose or see you as the bad guy? When you can't save everyone, how can you choose who to save? And what do you do when your principles conflict with the greater good? And for that matter, what does the greater good even look like? As imperfect as David Goyer's stories are, they are the furthest any Hollywood writer has gone into honestly exploring these ideas with depth and maturity while respecting the source material. And I love them for that. Quick side note, if you want to see me address some of Man of Steel's issues, I made a video fixing some of my problems with it a long time ago, which I'll link below, and I'm working on a heavily altered version of BVS that uses the same premise and explores the same themes without messily cramming so much into the runtime of a single film, though that will be a while before it's done. So subscribe to support the channel if you want to see that. So here we are, at the end of our journey. I don't think this is such a black and white argument as I may have initially presented it to be, but rather a broad spectrum with various shades of complexity. On one far end, we have the super simple black and white stories of good versus evil with no real nuance or complexity and nothing particularly thought-provoking to add to any conversation about morality. I think these stories are generally harmless on their own, but they don't really have anything to say. Meanwhile, on the far opposite end, we have stories with no morality whatsoever, where there is no good or bad, just a bunch of people doing whatever they want, generally for entirely selfish reasons, where nothing being fought for really matters, no one is really worth rooting for, and the overall message is nihilistic. Neither extreme teaches us anything. My biggest takeaway from writing this video is that true thematic depth is found the closer you get to the middle of the spectrum. I'm not saying all stories should exist exactly in the middle. Lord of the Rings is definitely closer to the black and white end of the spectrum, while Game of Thrones is clearly far more gray. And both have great depth in their own ways, and do what they intend to do very well. But I feel the most inspiring and the most thought-provoking stories are the ones that acknowledge the reality of good and evil, and try to teach some kind of moral truth while exploring their morality through complex human characters. Alright, I got to about this point in writing the script, when I started thinking about how to visualize this, and I realized that I'd been thinking of realism and idealism existing as ends on a simple one-dimensional scale, with depth and quality as some amorphous metric forming a sort of bell curve, being highest in the middle. However, that would be a drastic oversimplification, and I decided instead to measure the qualities of being thought-provoking and being inspiring separately, as I described them earlier in the video. Stories may be both inspiring and thought-provoking, or neither. To use examples we discussed, or that I used in the thumbnail, Lord of the Rings is very inspiring, but while I do consider elements of it to be thematically thought-provoking, it's not necessarily quite as complex as other stories. Meanwhile, A Song of Ice and Fire is, in many ways, arguably more thought-provoking, but far less inspiring. Dune is also very thought-provoking and very deep, though definitely not particularly inspiring. Meanwhile, the original Star Wars saga and classic iterations of Superman are highly inspiring, if not always super thought-provoking, though you could make a case for Star Wars having great depth at points, especially with Anakin's arc. Then you've got their twisted subversions like The Acolyte or The Boys, that I feel fall at the bottom of both scales. I believe both these qualities are important, that we need stories to challenge us and make us think critically about our beliefs, assumptions, and principles, while we also, perhaps now more than ever, need stories that inspire us to do better and be better. It is not mature simply to make your stories as uninspiring as possible without having anything of depth to say. As C.S. Lewis said, since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise you are making their destiny not brighter but darker. I believe the best stories are the ones that can both inspire and provoke critical thought, that can question what it really means to be a hero and challenge their characters to their core while retaining hope in the good of mankind and reminding us that it's worth fighting for. Thanks for sticking with me. I really appreciate it. I've been working on this video for quite a while and it feels great to finally have it out. But what do you think? Do you prefer stories that challenge you and make you think, or stories that inspire and uplift you? Do you think this was a fair way to measure the qualities of both kinds of stories? How would you measure them? This comment section is all yours, and I'm just here to kick off the conversation, so I look forward to hearing what you had to say and joining you down there. Until next time, never stay silent.